Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going deep into something that affects us all, even if we don't always realize it.
That's right, we're talking about environmental issues. Specifically, how Canada's dealing with those big challenges, climate change and biodiversity loss.
Oh, those are some heavy hitters, for sure. But you know what? We've got a pretty interesting mix of sources to dig through today.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there's this social studies textbook chapter, which is, the standard stuff. But then we've also got some interviews with students, which always gives a fresh perspective.
Students, huh? Always interesting to hear what they're thinking.
And get this, we even have kind of like a diary, personal reflections from an actual environmental advocate. Plus, there's this little quiz and FAQ document, so we can test our knowledge along the way.
Sounds like a real mixed bag. I'm curious to see how it all connects.
Me too. And I think what's really cool about this deep dive is that it's not just about, abstract concepts or far-off problems. It's about understanding how these environmental issues actually affect our lives, like right here, right now.
You're right. It's about the air we breathe, the water we drink, even the food we eat. It all ties back to the environment in some way.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is an environmental issue? We hear that term all the time, but what does it really mean?
The textbook, kind of predictably, defines it as any human activity that has a significant impact on the natural world. So, classic examples would be factory pollution or all that housing development that eats up green spaces.
Yeah, those are the images that immediately come to mind, right? Big smokestacks, sprawling suburbs.
Yeah.
But it really hits home when you think about how those things affect our everyday lives.
Exactly. It's not just some abstract concept. It's about the water we drink, the air we breathe, the very things that keep us healthy.
And the textbook actually has this mind map showing how everyone's connected to these issues. Like, it's not just about, big corporations or the government. It's about individuals, communities, businesses, the whole shebang.
It's a complex web, that's for sure. Shows you how interconnected we all are and how our actions, even seemingly small ones, can have consequences.
Okay, so we've got a handle on what environmental issues are. Now let's dive into one of the biggest ones. Climate change. Everyone always talks about rising temperatures, but isn't there more to it than just that?
Oh, absolutely. Climate change is about way more than just feeling a bit warmer. It's about shifts in weather patterns, impacts on agriculture, rising sea levels, the whole 9 yards. It's a truly global challenge, and it's going to manifest differently in different regions, which makes tackling it politically so complex.
Right, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just talking about climate change in some abstract way. We're looking at how it's playing out right here in Canada. And our sources show that the North, especially, is experiencing the fastest warming.
And that's having a direct impact on traditional Inuit ways of life, bringing up serious questions about Indigenous rights and environmental justice.
It's a stark reminder that climate change isn't just some future threat. It's happening right now, and it's already impacting people's lives. And, these impacts aren't limited to remote communities either.
You're right. Think about the increase in hurricane intensity we've seen, or those devastating floods in New Orleans. Scientists are linking those events directly to climate change.
It's kind of mind-boggling to think about those connections. But if we're serious about tackling climate change, don't we have to start with who's producing all those greenhouse gases in the first place?
Absolutely. You got to look at the sources of the problem. And in Canada, our sources point to Alberta and Ontario as the biggest CO2 emitters.
Which makes sense, right? Alberta's got the oil industry and Ontario's a manufacturing powerhouse.
Exactly. And that leads us right into that classic dilemma. How do you balance the economic benefits of these industries with the urgent need to cut emissions? It's a tough one.
It sounds like a real tightrope walk for policymakers. On the one hand, you've got jobs, economic growth, energy security. On the other hand, you've got climate change and the need to protect the environment for future generations.
And to add another layer of complexity, let's not forget about the United States. As our neighbor, they actually emit far more greenhouse gases than we do. So it's a global issue with regional variations, and finding solutions requires a whole lot of collaboration and compromise.
Collaboration, that's the key word. Speaking of which, we have to talk about the Kyoto Protocol. Canada's had a pretty, well, let's just say interesting relationship with that agreement, hasn't it?
Interesting is one way to put it. We signed onto this global plan to reduce emissions, then backed out under a new government, and now, from what I've read, it seems like we might be heading back to the negotiating table.
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what factors go into these decisions. Like, what makes a government decide to sign an international agreement, then back out, and then maybe reconsider?
It's a complex process, for sure. Different political parties often have different approaches, and sometimes those views evolve over time. But what's clear is that our stance on the Kyoto Protocol, that whole back and forth, it definitely impacts how other countries see us, and it raises questions about how committed we really are to tackling climate change.
Yeah, it definitely sends a mixed message. But you know what gives me hope? It's the fact that governments aren't the only ones who can make a difference. I mean, take Rob Grant's story, for example. This teenager started an environmental group at his school and actually got them to install solar panels. How cool is that?
That's an incredible story, isn't it? What I find so inspiring about Rob's story is that he didn't just rely on one tactic. His group, they launched awareness campaigns, did a ton of fundraising, and worked with local businesses. They really understood how to pull those different levers to make change happen.
That's a fantastic example of how young people can be powerful agents of change. It's about understanding how to leverage those different avenues of influence, isn't it? And it gives me hope knowing that we all have that potential to make a difference.
It does, doesn't it? And it makes you think about the different levers for change that exist, especially as we move into talking about one of the biggest environmental debates here in Canada, the oil sands.
Right, the oil sands. Vital to Canada's economy, but also a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's that classic trade-off we were talking about earlier.
A textbook case, actually. On the one hand, you have the Premier of Alberta, who's pro-development, talking about the economic benefits, all the jobs the oil sands create.
And then on the other side, there's this whole coalition of environmental groups, Indigenous communities, and concerned citizens who are saying, hold on, the environmental costs are just too high. We need to slow down.
It's a real clash of values, isn't it? Whose quality of life are we prioritizing, and how do we balance those competing interests?
It's a tough question. And it's not just some theoretical debate happening in the halls of power. It affects all of us.
Absolutely. Think about it. Every time we fill our gas tanks, heat our homes, we're connected to those choices being made about the oil sands.
It's a reminder that even our everyday actions are part of this bigger picture.
They really are. And you know what I found interesting? There are some really clever cartoons in our sources that touch on this whole debate about the government's role in the economy, especially when it comes to environmental issues. They add a bit of humor to a serious topic, but they also illustrate how these debates are always present, always evolving.
It's a reminder that these issues aren't just about science and economics. They're also about values, about perspectives, about how we see our place in the world. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another big environmental concern, biodiversity. I feel like when people hear biodiversity, they think about saving cute animals. But it's so much bigger than that, right?
Oh, way bigger. Our textbook defines it as the variety and number of living things on Earth, which sounds simple enough. But think about it. This variety of life, it's essential for maintaining those healthy ecosystems that provide us with clean air and water, regulate the climate, and even contribute to our cultural and spiritual well-being.
It's like we're all part of this giant interconnected web, and we often don't even realize how much we rely on it.
Exactly. And to really understand the real-world implications of biodiversity loss, we need to turn to Cliff Wallace, our eco-warrior diarist. He's got some seriously insightful perspectives on this topic.
I'm all ears. What kind of approach does he take to conservation efforts?
Well, what's fascinating is that he talks about using a network approach. It's about building common ground among a really diverse range of stakeholders, businesses, Indigenous communities, government agencies to find solutions that work for everyone.
That's such a valuable approach, don't you think? Building consensus, finding common ground, that's something we could apply to so many challenges, not just environmental ones.
I agree. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together. And Cliff brings this approach to life with a really powerful story about the woodland caribou.
I've heard about them. They're struggling, aren't they?
They are. They've been hit hard by habitat loss caused by logging, oil and gas development, and other human activities. It's a stark reminder of how our actions can have far-reaching consequences, impacting even the most remote parts of the ecosystem.
It's heartbreaking to think about those impacts. So how does Cliff propose we tackle these kinds of issues? Where do we even begin when it comes to protecting biodiversity?
He talks about identifying and utilizing the right levers, those strategic pressure points that can drive change. He outlines three main ones: markets, laws, and international agreements.
3 levers. Okay. Let's start with markets. What does he mean by that?
Well, he argues that consumer demand for sustainably produced products can influence companies to adopt more environmentally friendly practices.
So it's about using our purchasing power to drive change. I can see how that could be a powerful lever.
Exactly. A great example is the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC. They set standards for responsible forestry practices, and companies that meet those standards, they get their products certified. Consumers who see that little FSC logo, they know they're making a choice that supports responsible forestry.
Oh yeah, I've seen that logo. It's amazing how a simple symbol can make you feel like you're making a difference.
It's about empowering consumers to make informed choices. And then there's the laws lever. Cliff argues that strong environmental regulations are absolutely crucial, especially for those industries that have a big impact on biodiversity.
So things like setting limits on pollution or creating protected areas for wildlife makes sense. Are there any examples here in Canada where that lever's been used effectively?
Definitely. He mentions the Species at Risk Act, or SARA for short, which is designed to protect endangered species, including our caribou friend we were just talking about. It's a legal framework that's supposed to help safeguard our natural heritage.
It's good to know that those legal protections are in place. So what about that third lever? International agreements. I feel like we've touched on that already.
We have with the Kyoto Protocol, but Cliff emphasizes that environmental issues often cross national borders, so to solve them, we need cooperation on a global scale.
Makes sense. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected and that these problems are bigger than any one country.
Exactly. He highlights the Convention on Biological Diversity as a key example. It's an international treaty that Canada has signed, and it's all about countries working together to conserve biodiversity and make sure the benefits from using natural resources are shared fairly.
It sounds like it all comes down to finding the right balance, doesn't it? Using those three levers in a strategic way to make lasting change.
It does, and that brings us back to the question of citizen action. What role do we play in all of this? What can we do as individuals to protect biodiversity here in Canada?
That's a great question. Because it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these issues. Like, what can one person really do? But you know what? Our textbook actually has a whole section on getting involved. It even has a step-by-step guide, which I thought was really helpful.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. And it emphasizes that taking action can be as simple as making informed choices about the things we buy. It's something we've talked about before, that idea of consumer power.
Right. Every purchase is like a vote. It's about aligning our spending with our values.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of just talking about these issues, spreading awareness, starting conversations. You never know who you might inspire.
It's about being the change you want to see in the world, right? Even something as simple as sharing an article online or having a conversation with a friend can make a difference. You never know what kind of ripple effect it might create.
You really don't. And speaking of information, there's one more source we need to dig into. That quiz and FAQ document we mentioned earlier. It's like a cheat sheet for understanding the key points about environmental issues in Canada.
A cheat sheet, huh? I could use one of those. So what kind of burning questions does it address?
Well, it tackles that really fundamental one. What are environmental issues, and why should we Canadians even care?
Right, like why should this stuff matter to us on a personal level?
It basically boils down to this. Environmental issues come from human activities that end up impacting the natural world, the world we all depend on.
Okay, so there's that cause and effect relationship. Our actions have consequences, but what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
The consequences can be pretty significant. We're talking things that can affect the air we breathe, the water we drink, the health of entire ecosystems, and even the availability of the natural resources we rely on.
So it's not just about, like, saving the whales or protecting the rainforest. It actually hits a lot closer to home.
Exactly. It's about our health, our well-being, and the quality of life we enjoy here in Canada.
And the FAQ also points out that these environmental issues are totally intertwined with political and economic decision-making.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Governments are the ones setting the rules for how we manage pollution, resources, conservation efforts. And businesses and industries are making decisions every day that impact the environment. It's all connected.
It's like this complex web of interconnected systems, and we're all part of it.
Right. And then there's the big one, the one we can't ignore, climate change. The document lays out a pretty clear explanation of what climate change is and how it could impact Canadians.
We've talked about it a bit already, but I think it's worth a recap. What is climate change exactly, and why should we be concerned about it?
In a nutshell, climate change is this long-term shift in global temperatures and weather patterns. And it's mostly driven by the increased emissions of those greenhouse gases we talked about earlier, primarily from human activities like burning fossil fuels.
Okay, so those greenhouse gases are the main culprit, and we've already established that Canada has its fair share of industries pumping those out. What does the FAQ say about the potential impact of all this?
It paints a pretty sobering picture, actually. It talks about things like rising sea levels that could threaten our coastal communities, more frequent and severe extreme weather events, changes in agricultural yields, and disruptions to ecosystems and freshwater resources.
That's a lot to process, really.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like climate change could touch pretty much every aspect of our life.
It really could, and it makes that whole Kyoto Protocol situation even more complex, doesn't it? Knowing what we know now, was it the right move for Canada to withdraw from that agreement?
It's a tough one, isn't it?
It is. There are strong arguments on both sides. Some folks say the Kyoto Protocol was too ambitious, that those emissions targets were unrealistic and would hurt our economy. Others argue that it was a missed opportunity, a failure of leadership that prioritized short-term gains over our long-term responsibility to the planet.
Yeah, it's hard to know what the right answer is, but it definitely highlights how complex these issues are and how difficult it can be to find solutions that satisfy everyone.
Absolutely. So, with all that in mind, what does the FAQ actually suggest we do about climate change? How do we respond to something this big and complicated?
Right, where do we even begin?
Well, it calls for a multi-pronged approach, basically, with everyone doing their part. It suggests that governments can enact policies that encourage renewable energy sources, like wind and solar power, things that will help us move away from fossil fuels.
So shifting away from those fossil fuels is a key part of the solution.
It seems to be. And it's not just about energy production. The FAQ also talks about improving energy efficiency, like supporting better building practices, public transportation, and investing in research to develop cleaner technologies.
That makes sense. But it sounds like it's not just up to the government to solve this, right?
Not at all. Consumers have a big role to play too. The FAQ encourages us to think about our choices, opting for sustainable products, reducing energy use at home, and choosing more eco-friendly transportation options.
So it's about those everyday decisions, right? Those small choices that can add up to make a difference.
Exactly. And industries need to step up too, They've got to start adopting cleaner technologies and investing in research and development to make their operations more sustainable.
It sounds like it really takes a collective effort. Everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to another critical environmental issue the FAQ dives into: biodiversity. It starts by defining what biodiversity is and why it's so important to protect it.
We talked about it a bit earlier, but a refresher never hurts. Remind us, what exactly is biodiversity and why should we be concerned about it?
Biodiversity is all about the incredible variety of life we have here on Earth.
Hmm.
It's all the different plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms, you name it. Even the genetic variation within species is part of biodiversity.
Wow, that's a pretty broad definition.
Yeah.
So why is it so important to protect all this diversity?
For a whole bunch of reasons, actually. Biodiversity plays a crucial role in keeping our ecosystems healthy. And remember, healthy ecosystems provide all sorts of benefits for humans.
Right, we were talking about those ecological services earlier, the clean air and water, climate regulation, all those good things.
Exactly. Biodiversity helps with all of that. It supports our food security, contributes to our cultural and spiritual well-being. It's about more than just pretty flowers and cute animals. It's about protecting the intricate web of life that sustains us all.
Okay, that makes sense. So what does the FAQ say about how we can protect biodiversity here in Canada? What concrete steps can we take?
It emphasizes both individual and collective action. So on the individual level, it encourages us to make sustainable choices in our daily lives, like the things we buy, how we get around, how much energy we use. And then on a larger scale, it suggests we can support conservation organizations, get involved in citizen science projects, and advocate for policies that protect our natural heritage.
So it's about using our voices and our choices to make a difference.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in this. It really does feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from those big picture questions about what environmental issues are and why they matter to exploring some really specific examples of how these issues are playing out here in Canada.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
And I think what struck me the most is how complex these issues are. There's so many factors to consider: the science, the economics, the politics, the social impacts.
It's definitely not a simple problem solution kind of situation. And you know what else has really stood out for me? It's this theme of interconnectedness that keeps popping up.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. We're not just talking about isolated problems here. Everything's linked together.
Exactly. The health of our ecosystems is linked to our own well-being. Our individual choices are linked to these larger global challenges. And the actions of governments and industries have a ripple effect that impacts all of us.
It's like we're all part of this giant web. We're all tugging on different threads.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us back to that idea of environmental stewardship that we touched on earlier. It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to care for this planet, not just for ourselves, but for future generations.
Yeah, that stewardship idea really resonated with me. It's about recognizing that we're not just, inhabitants of this planet. We're caretakers. We have a duty to protect it.
Precisely. And that sense of stewardship, it can take so many forms. It could be as simple as choosing to buy sustainably produced products or reducing our energy consumption at home.
Or it could be about advocating for stronger environmental policies or supporting those organizations that are on the front lines of protecting our natural heritage.
Exactly. There are so many ways to contribute, and it's about finding those actions that feel meaningful and impactful to you.
It's about figuring out where you fit into that larger web of action. And, one thing that really helped me visualize this was Cliff Wallace's idea of those levers for change. Remember how he talked about markets, laws, and international agreements?
Oh, yeah. Those levers were a brilliant way to frame it. He was talking about how those are the tools that can be used to shift systems and drive large-scale change.
But what I found so powerful about that concept is that it can be applied on a personal level, too. We all have our own set of levers.
Yeah.
The choices we make every day, the way we spend our money, the causes we support, the conversations we have.
Yeah.
Those are all levers that we can use to make a difference.
I love that. It's like we're all mini change makers, each with our own unique set of tools and influence.
Exactly. And, one of the things that really stood out in the student interviews was how passionate young people are about environmental issues. They're not just sitting around waiting for someone else to fix things. They're taking action, they're raising their voices, they're demanding change.
It's incredibly inspiring to see that energy and commitment. And it reminds us that we're not alone in this. There's a whole generation of young people who are ready to step up and be part of the solution.
And you know what? That gives me hope. Because it's easy to get bogged down by all the bad news, to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges we face. But seeing those young people taking action, it's a powerful reminder that change is possible.
It is. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's the message we want to leave our listeners with, that sense of hope and possibility.
Yes. It's not about despair. It's about empowerment. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a healthier, more sustainable future.
Exactly. So to all you deep divers out there, we want to leave you with a challenge. Think about those personal levers we talked about. What choices can you make in your everyday life that align with your values? How can you use your influence to inspire others? What kind of future do you want to see for Canada? And what actions can you take to help create it?
Those are great questions to ponder. And we hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge and inspiration to start taking action.
We believe in you, deep divers. The future of our planet is in our hands. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making those choices that create a healthier, more sustainable world.
Thanks for joining us.